They thought they could take my land without consequences. They assumed I wouldn't fight back. But when the HOA decided to turn my private property into a community park without my consent, they had no idea they were handing me the biggest financial opportunity of my life. And when my neighbor Karen and her entitled guests pushed me too far, I made sure they'd regret ever underestimating me. It all started with the rain. A relentless downpour had transformed the streets into small rivers, leaving the neighborhood struggling to stay dry. I own a large warehouse on my property, an old but sturdy structure that I primarily use for storage. It wasn't anything fancy, just a functional space that sat on land my family had owned for decades. But that didn't stop Karen, the self-appointed queen of our neighborhood, from treating it like her personal convenience. That evening, as the storm raged, her guests began arriving. An endless line of expensive SUVs and sedans rolling into the street. The moment I saw them stepping out, glancing nervously at the growing puddles, I knew exactly what was about to happen. Sure enough, Karen took charge like she always did. She waved over her guests, motioning toward my warehouse as if it belonged to her. Without hesitation, they began guiding their vehicles inside, claiming shelter from the rain without so much as a courtesy knock on my door. I watched from my window, seething, as car after car disappeared behind the warehouse's rolling doors. No permission, no acknowledgement, just entitlement. I had dealt with Karen's arrogance before, but this was beyond disrespectful. It was an outright invasion, and they had no idea what was coming next. I could have stormed outside. I could have shouted, argued, demanded they move. But I didn't. Instead, I let them have their moment of comfort, parking their gleaming vehicles in my warehouse as if it were a public garage. The storm outside was unforgiving, but inside, they must have felt secure, oblivious to the fact that their little act of entitlement had just handed me the perfect opportunity to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. Without a word, I grabbed my keys, walked outside, and manually locked the warehouse's heavy-duty doors. The sound of the bolt sliding into place was satisfying, final. The vehicles were trapped inside, completely at my mercy. I didn't need to confront Karen or her guests. I had a better plan. My bags were already packed for a business trip I had scheduled out of town, and I had no intention of letting their selfishness disrupt my plans. So, without a second thought, I got in my truck and drove away, leaving them to wonder why their cars were no longer accessible. Hours later, my phone buzzed. Then again, and again. By the time I checked it, I had dozens of missed calls, all from unknown numbers. I smirked, knowing exactly who it was. Karen and her entitled friends must have realized what had happened. Maybe they had tried to open the warehouse doors, only to find them locked tight. Maybe they had called the police, expecting immediate action. But here's the thing. This was my private property. They had trespassed, and now they were at my mercy. When I finally answered a call, I didn't bother with pleasantries. I let the silence drag on until an angry voice exploded on the other end. "You locked our cars inside your warehouse. Open it now." I leaned back in my hotel chair, feigning surprise. "Oh, my warehouse. You mean the one on my private property? You can't do this." Karen screeched, her voice thick with the same entitlement that had gotten her into this mess. "We needed shelter from the rain. You had space. What's a big deal?" I chuckled, calm and composed. "The big deal is that none of you asked. You just assumed. And now you're demanding?" "No, Karen. That's not how this works." The threats came next. Legal action. Complaints to the HOA. Even the ridiculous claim that she would have me arrested. I let her ramble, knowing full well that she had no ground to stand on. Her guests had parked on my land, in my warehouse, without permission. If anything, I had every right to call the police on them for trespassing. But I wasn't done yet. I had a much bigger game in mind. Before Karen could say another word, I ended the call. Then I powered off my phone completely. Let them stew in their frustration. Let them feel powerless for once. Meanwhile, I had business to take care of, business that would turn their little stunt into my greatest advantage yet. By the time I returned home 2 days later, the chaos had reached new heights. Karen had mobilized the entire neighborhood against me, painting herself as the victim and twisting the narrative to fit her usual self-righteous delusions. HOA notices littered my doorstep, each one more absurd than the last. Warnings of noncompliance, threats of fines, and even an official-looking document claiming I had violated community policies by illegally seizing private property. It was laughable. These people had trespassed on my land, used my warehouse without permission, and now had the audacity to act as if I had committed some grand injustice. But what they failed to realize was that they had handed me the perfect opportunity to turn this situation into something far bigger than their petty complaints. I ignored the HOA's nonsense and went straight to my warehouse. The sight was as satisfying as I had imagined. Karen and her guests' vehicles were still trapped inside, untouched, just as they had left them. The only difference now was the mounting desperation evident in the voicemails they had bombarded me with. At first, it had been threats, demands to unlock the doors immediately, but as the hours turned into days, their tone had shifted. Pleas, apologies, even weak attempts at negotiation. But I wasn't in the business of giving second chances, especially not to people who had spent years treating me as nothing more than an inconvenience. They had crossed the line, and now it was time for me to collect. I spent the morning making calls, reaching out to a few contacts I had in the event industry. The warehouse, as much as it had been useful for storage, was sitting on prime real estate. It was large, structurally sound, and conveniently located. I had thought about repurposing it before, but now, after seeing how effortlessly people had used it as a shelter, a new idea took hold. If they wanted to treat my property like a public space, I'd make it one on my terms. Within hours, I had a business plan in motion. The warehouse would become an official event venue, available for rentals, bookings, and most importantly, under my full control. I filed the necessary paperwork, making everything legal and untouchable by the HOA's overreaching policies. Once the foundation was in place, I made my next move, sending Karen and her friend a bill. Each car owner received an official invoice, detailing storage fees for the days their vehicles had occupied my warehouse. The charges weren't excessive, just enough to make it clear that their entitlement had a cost. Late fees applied after 24 hours. Non-payment would result in lien claims on their vehicles. I printed everything, sealed the envelopes, and personally delivered them to each doorstep. By nightfall, my phone rang again, and this time, the panic in Karen's voice was unmistakable. The HOA had no authority over private business operations, and now she and her guests were faced with a simple choice: pay up or deal with the consequences. Word spread fast. Neighbors whispered, speculated, and debated over whether I could actually follow through. Some thought I was bluffing. Others, especially those who had dealt with Karen's antics before, cheered me on in silence. But I wasn't bluffing. I had already consulted with a legal expert, ensuring every step I took was airtight. When the first guest reluctantly sent a payment, the rest followed, one by one, until even Karen was forced to hand over the money she had sworn she would never pay. I had turned their arrogance into profit, and I wasn't done yet. With the warehouse now officially an event venue, I wasted no time marketing it. Weddings, corporate gatherings, private parties. People were willing to pay good money for a well-located space. The irony was delicious. The same community that had once dismissed me, the same HOA that had tried to dictate what I could do with my own property, was now watching as I turned my land into a thriving business. Karen's reaction was predictable. She fumed, complained, and even tried to rally the HOA into enforcing new restrictions, but it was too late. I had made sure that every permit, every approval, and every legal requirement was secured before she even knew what was happening. By the time the first event was hosted in the warehouse, it was clear that the battle had shifted. No longer was I the quiet neighbor they could push around. I had taken control, flipped the narrative, and forced them to see me not as an inconvenience, but as someone they couldn't ignore. The warehouse, once an empty storage space, was now booked for months in advance. Money flowed in, and with every successful event, the HOA's grip weakened. Karen, once the loudest voice in the neighborhood, had been reduced to bitter glares and empty threats. But I wasn't concerned about her anymore. I had won, and the best part? I had done on my terms. Success had a way of silencing doubters, but Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. The moment she realized she couldn't force me to undo what I had built, she shifted tactics. Instead of direct confrontation, she began working behind the scenes, whispering complaints into the ears of HOA board members, pushing for new rules, and attempting to manipulate the neighborhood against me. Petty fines started appearing in my mailbox, fabricated violations, ridiculous restrictions meant to complicate my business operations. Notices claimed I was disturbing the peace, even though my venue followed strict noise regulations. Others suggested my events were causing traffic congestion, despite the fact that I had arranged off-site parking solutions. It was an orchestrated attack, a desperate attempt to claw back control, but I had expected nothing less from someone like Karen. I responded not with anger, but with strategy. Every citation, every warning, every baseless fine was challenged legally. I documented everything, gathered evidence, and ensured that my operation remained untouchable. Instead of pushing back aggressively, I used their own bureaucracy against them, drowning them in paperwork, appeals, and legal counteractions. HOA meetings became battlegrounds where their own rules exposed their incompetence. One by one, their attempts to stifle me collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. Frustration rippled through their ranks, but I remained patient, allowing them to exhaust themselves in a war they could never win. The real turning point came when local businesses took notice of my venue. Word had spread beyond the neighborhood, attracting attention from catering services, event planners, and entertainment professionals. Partnerships formed, deals were made, and soon, my venue wasn't just a local attraction. It became a recognized business hub. Corporate clients booked conferences, high-end weddings filled the calendar, and my property, once dismissed as a mere warehouse, became a cornerstone of the community's economy. Money changed everything. As revenue poured in, my influence grew, and suddenly, the same HOA that had tried to bury me found itself powerless against the very thing they had created. Karen's desperation escalated into recklessness. When she failed to sabotage me through legal means, she resorted to more aggressive tactics. Anonymous complaints flooded city offices, alleging zoning violations, fabricated safety concerns, and baseless accusations of misconduct. Inspectors arrived, only to find that everything was up to code, every detail meticulously handled. The city saw through the charade quickly, but I knew Karen wouldn't stop unless she was forced to face the consequences of her actions. She had underestimated me before, assuming I was just a stubborn neighbor she could steamroll, but now she was beginning to realize that I wasn't just defending my property, I was expanding my empire. I decided to take the final step in securing my victory. Instead of merely fighting off Karen's attacks, I set my sights on dismantling the very system that had enabled her antics in the first place. The HOA had long operated with unchecked authority, but now, with my growing business and community support, I had the leverage to challenge its power. I gathered signatures, rallied homeowners who had suffered under its rule, and proposed a vote to dissolve the HOA entirely. The same neighbors who had once been wary of me now saw the truth. Karen and her cronies weren't protecting the community, they were exploiting it for their own control. When the vote was announced, panic spread through Karen's ranks. She scrambled to regain favor, tried to convince others that my success was a threat to their way of life, but the damage was done. The community had grown tired of her games, tired of the constant overreach, tired of being pawns in her petty feuds. The final vote was overwhelming. The HOA was officially disbanded. Decades of their oppressive rule collapsed in a single night, and the neighborhood was finally free from their control. Karen's downfall was swift. Without the HOA's backing, she lost her influence entirely. The same people who once followed her lead now ignored her entirely. Her reputation was shattered, her ability to manipulate others gone. And as for my business, it thrived. The warehouse-turned-venue continued to grow, attracting high-profile clients, generating wealth, and proving beyond any doubt that I had won. What had started as a petty act of entitlement had become the very thing that secured my success. As I stood outside my venue, watching yet another high-end event unfold, I couldn't help but smile. Karen had thought she could control me, thought she could dictate what happened on my land. But in the end, it was her arrogance that fueled my success. She had tried to take from me, but instead, she had given me everything I needed to turn the tables. I hadn't just defeated her. I had built something that would last long after her influence had faded into nothing. Karen's silence didn't last long. The dissolution of the HOA had left her reeling, stripped of the authority she had wielded like a weapon for years. But people like her never truly accepted defeat. Instead of quietly fading into the background, she became more erratic, more desperate to regain control. At first, it was subtle. Petty complaints, whispers to anyone who would listen, attempt to undermine my business through the same manipulative tactics she had always used. But as time went on and she realized that her influence had completely crumbled, she grew reckless. One night, I found evidence of vandalism outside my venue. Damaged signs, broken lights, small but deliberate acts of sabotage. I knew exactly who was behind it, but I also knew that reacting impulsively would only give her the attention she craved. Instead of confronting her, I did what I had always done. I turned the situation to my advantage. Security cameras were installed, not just around the venue, but also along the property's perimeter. Every inch was monitored, every entrance secured. Within days, footage captured Karen lurking near my property after dark, her movements suspicious, her intentions obvious. I didn't go to the police immediately. I let her dig her own grave, let her believe she was getting away with her pathetic attempts to retaliate. Then, when I had gathered enough evidence, I filed a formal complaint for trespassing and property damage. The authorities had no choice but to take action. Karen, once so feared in the neighborhood, was now a legal liability. She was forced to attend hearings, explain herself to officials who no longer saw her as a figure of authority, but as a nuisance. The irony was perfect. She had spent years weaponizing the HOA against others, and now she was the one facing real consequences. While Karen fought to salvage the last remnants of her reputation, my business continued to expand. The demand for my venue skyrocketed, attracting not just local clients, but people from neighboring towns who had heard about the exclusive space. With the revenue flowing in, I reinvested into the property, transforming it beyond what anyone in the neighborhood had imagined. The old warehouse was no longer just a functional event space. It became a high-end venue, complete with a redesigned interior, state-of-the-art lighting, and customized event packages that catered to elite clients. What had started as a necessity to protect my property had turned into a flourishing empire, and Karen could do nothing but watch as everything she had once controlled slipped further from her grasp. But her bitterness refused to fade. When legal battles and vandalism failed, she resorted to her final, most desperate move, spreading lies. Suddenly, false rumors circulated about my business, absurd accusations meant to scare off potential clients. She claimed my venue was unsafe, that it was under investigation, that authorities were planning to shut it down. Of course, none of it was true, but Karen wasn't targeting logic. She was targeting perception. If she could create enough doubt, enough whispers of suspicion, she thought she could damage what I had built. But what she failed to understand was that I was always 10 steps ahead. Before her lies could take hold, I went on the offensive. I reached out to local media, shared my story with community leaders, and made sure that the truth was louder than Karen's fabrications. My business wasn't just surviving, it was thriving because of my ability to outmaneuver every obstacle thrown my way. Instead of harming my reputation, Karen's lies backfired spectacularly, further cementing her downfall. People saw through her desperation, and those who had once followed her lead now wanted nothing to do with her. The final blow came when she was sued for defamation by another local business owner she had targeted with similar tactics. With legal fees mounting and no allies left to defend her, Karen had no choice but to sell her home and leave the neighborhood altogether. As I stood on my newly expanded property, watching guests arrive for another high-profile event, I couldn't help but appreciate the poetic justice of it all. Karen had spent years believing she could control everything and everyone around her. But in the end, she had been the architect of her own destruction. She had tried to turn the community against me, but instead, she had driven them to support me. She had tried to ruin my business, but in doing so, she had only given me the motivation to make it stronger than ever. With Karen gone, the neighborhood finally found peace. No more pointless fines, no more manufactured conflicts, no more power struggles disguised as community governance. People could live without the constant interference of an overbearing HOA, and my business could operate without the looming threat of petty restrictions. What had started as a fight for my own property had transformed into something much bigger, a victory not just for me, but for the entire community. As I locked up the venue that night, the once abandoned warehouse, now a symbol of everything I had accomplished, I realized something. Karen had never truly been my biggest obstacle. The real challenge had been proving that I was stronger than the circumstances she tried to trap me in. And in the end, not only had I won, I had built something that would outlast every petty scheme, every attempt to hold me back, and every entitled neighbor who thought they could control me. The transformation of my property was more than just a financial success. It was a statement. What had once been a forgotten warehouse was now the most sought-after event space in the area. And the irony wasn't lost on the people who had once dismissed me. The same neighbors who had whispered behind my back, who had hesitated to take my side when Karen had tried to bury me, now eagerly recommended my venue to their friends, boasting about how they lived near the most exclusive space in town. The hypocrisy amused me, but I didn't hold grudges. If anything, their change in attitude only solidified what I had always known. Power belonged to those who refused to let others dictate their worth. I had taken control of my own fate, and nothing Karen or the HOA had done could stop me from thriving. With the HOA dismantled, the neighborhood found a new sense of freedom. People began making improvements to their homes without fear of arbitrary fines. Families hosted gatherings without the looming presence of unnecessary restrictions. For the first time in years, the community felt like an actual community, not just a collection of houses under the control of a self-imposed authority. Some of the former HOA board members moved away, unable to function without their false sense of power, while others simply faded into the background, realizing that their influence had vanished. Without their interference, the neighborhood flourished, and even those who had initially resisted the change couldn't deny that life was better without them. My venue continued to grow, attracting high-profile clients and cementing its reputation as a premier event space. The revenue I generated allowed me to reinvest, expanding the business beyond what I had originally envisioned. I added outdoor seating areas, a fully equipped catering kitchen, and even partnered with local vendors to create an all-inclusive experience for guests. What had started as a way to reclaim my own land had become a legacy, something that would last far beyond any petty neighborhood squabbles. The best part was knowing that every success, every milestone, every booking was a direct result of turning their arrogance into opportunity. Karen's absence was barely noticed. After selling her home, she disappeared without a trace, her reign of entitlement reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. Occasionally, I would hear murmurs about her trying to insert herself into another community, attempting to regain the power she had lost, but it never lasted. Once people saw her for what she truly was, they wanted nothing to do with her. She had spent years believing she was untouchable, but in the end, she had learned the hard way that control is an illusion, and power only exists if people are willing to give it to you. One evening, as I stood on the newly built outdoor patio of my venue, watching the sunset cast a golden hue over the land that had once been the center of so much conflict, I realized something important. Karen had never really been my biggest problem, nor had the HOA. They were merely obstacles, temporary challenges meant to test my resolve. The real battle had always been about something greater, proving that no one had the right to dictate what I could do with what was mine. And in that battle, I had not just survived. I had won. The final and most unexpected victory came when a real estate investor approached me with an offer. He had seen what I had built, recognized its potential, and wanted to expand it into something even larger, a multi-property event business that could serve multiple locations. The number he placed on the table was staggering, a figure I had never imagined when I first locked those warehouse doors and drove away, leaving Karen's guests to deal with the consequences of their entitlement. The offer meant I could take what I had built and expand on my own terms beyond this neighborhood, beyond this town. It was a full-circle moment, proof that every challenge, every fight, and every petty act of sabotage had only pushed me towards something greater. As I shook hands with the investor, sealing the deal that would take my success to the next level, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. The HOA had tried to control me. Karen had tried to destroy me. But in the end, they had been nothing more than stepping stones on my path to something bigger. What they had meant as a punishment had become my greatest triumph. And as I left that meeting, walking away with the knowledge that my business was about to expand beyond anything they had ever imagined, I knew one thing for certain. I had turned their entitlement into my empire, and there was nothing they could do to stop me now.